Welcome, and thank you for joining the Succeed with Jitterbit track for Jitterbit Integrate. My name is Dan Moore, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Customer Success here at Jitterbit. And in my role, I have the distinct pleasure of working closely with you, our customers, but also with Jitterbit's dedicated customer success team members, technical support engineers, training and documentation developers, professional services, and customer success architects, everyone whose sole focus is on helping you achieve maximum value from your use of Jitterbit. The next 3 hours are filled with sessions featuring those very customer success team members who will provide valuable best practices, tips, and tricks on how current Jitterbit users can achieve success. If you're not a current Jitterbit user, you may want to hop on the Learn with Jitterbit track or the Partner track. Now, in a few minutes, we'll be kicking off the first of 3 sessions, the Jitterbit Meetup hosted by customer success architects Jaime Delgado and Mayank Basin. Before we get going here, I wanted to let you know that we will be giving away a pair of Apple AirPod Pros to one lucky winner in each session. So please stay tuned, as winners will be announced at the end of the session. Now let's get into the content, and please welcome Philippe Turpot, Vice President of Your Success. Phil, over to you.
Well, thank you, Dan, and welcome to all our customers. We are very excited about being able to talk about best practices, tips, and tricks. And I will hand over for the content of the best practices and health check to Jaime Delgado and Mayank Basin. But we do those virtual meetup on a regular basis. We coincided this one with the user conference. We want to make sure that this is something you get as much value as possible. We have, you can ask questions. There is a question and answer window where you can type your questions, and then we'll be addressing them as we go. We also have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll be able to go through all the questions that you may have entered during the presentation. Today's presentation will be about health checks. What do we do? What should you expect? When to get the most value out of a health check that we provide on your projects? Let's make it interactive as much as possible. We are posting all our virtual conferences on Success, Jitterbit Success, so you can see previous one, and we'll have another one coming up in June. Topics to be announced. Today's topic is health check, as I just mentioned, and those virtual meetup they are here to help you address some of the questions you might have. So as you work with your customer success manager, let them know what topics make sense to cover. What do you want us to talk about? It could be from APIs, from integrations, from specific software development lifecycle methodology. Any of the topics that covers integration, APIs, real-time batch, and things you're trying to accomplish. We want this to be directly useful. It comes with also CSA office hours that we do on Wednesday. We also do some tech talks from time to time. All this material is driven by your request. So if there's something you want us to cover, we're happy to put it together into a forum, put a video, and then give you the ability to review it later as needed. But at this point for health check, I'm going to hand it over to Jaime Delgado and Mayank Basin to introduce themselves and take you to the program, to the slides.
Thanks, Phil. Welcome to everybody, and I'm Jaime Delgado, Customer Success Architect, and I work along with Mayank. Mayank, if you wanted to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jaime. This is Mayank. I work with Jaime as a Customer Success Architect, and I've been with the Jitterbit for more than 6 months now. Been an Enterprise Data Integration Architect for many years now. So, Jaime, over to you.
Yeah, so we wanted to take you through health check and what that means for customers and how to be able to get access to health checks. And so The health check, starting with what it is the capability to contact us and be able to request that health check to get an idea of what what it is that you want to do or should be doing with your projects, and get sort of also an indication of how to get on a healthy path and get the most out of the investment in the Jitterbit platform. So we'll take a look at what the health check is, how to request it, what to do and what not to do, and then just take some questions around the health check. So the health check is really an optional no-cost service to our customers, and it's performed by a customer success architect, such as myself or Mayank. And it's personalized to your org and your environment and the goals that you have for the different applications that you're trying to integrate. And so we, as experts, go ahead and review your project or a set of projects that are of high value to you in your current setup, and we give you insights into that project. We review within the current environment what you have set up. Are you maximizing the potential of the features in the platform? And also give you some tips on best practices. How does what's implemented, how does that match up with our best practices and the configuration within the organization? We go ahead and document this information for you, the findings of the health check, give you some details and suggestions on how you might make those changes and get the benefits out of the platform based on your goals. And so what we do is we take a look at the current implementation, we capture that information. We take also a look at some of the errors that you're getting in your platform, in your implementation, and identify any kind of opportunities that you may have for making those improvements. Also, if there's any other endpoints or functionality within the platform that you could leverage to get the best out of what you have implemented. So I'll just take a quick moment here and show you an example of what that output might look like. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it. But what you would see is that a document similar to this, where we identify, okay, here's your organization, what the subscription is, whether you're on professional, standard, whatever, and then also how many projects are deployed, how many operations, the number of users, what's the agent configuration like, so the different agent groups and how many local agents you may have, the number of APIs that are implemented. And so, we just start documenting this information for you so that you can get an idea of within each of these sections where you might be able to take some action to improve on the implementation. So we take a look at the agent groups and identify, okay, well, if you only have one agent in an agent group, you might want to consider getting a second agent so that you can achieve high availability and be able to have seamless upgrades and some information on some links on where you can find more information on the configuration of HA within an agent group, how your users are getting logged on to Jitterbit. So is SSO implemented, and also start to look at the number of projects that are in production, and go deeper down into those, into each of those sections. So how, if you're leveraging API or API management module, and if there's any use cases around that and how you could use that. And also within that, if you were using the APIs, we take a look at the security profiles. If you're using the portal manager, take a look at the activity logs, and we just start looking at the actual logs. We look at some of the errors in the logs that are there, and start to see, hey, maybe some of these you need to look into further. Maybe look at an example of several errors and how to better respond to those errors, and whether there needs to be some notification around those errors and how to do that. And so we go deeper into the projects themselves, into the operations, and identify what kind of improvements can be made in those projects. So the organization of the project, also if there's any kind of improvements to be made to the folder structure of those projects, whether the endpoints are using project variables to help the migration and deployment cycle from development to QA to production, and then give you some examples on how to do that, where you do that in the tool, and where there are opportunities to implement those project variables. We also look at creating dynamic components in, for example, the files, and when you're writing to sources and targets, whether you can provide and leverage project variables and not have to have hard-coded values within your scripting. And so we start to look at all of those things within the health check and give you examples on where, how you might be able to implement that. So we have some examples via our Rat Pack where we can actually deliver some examples to you on where you could implement that and what benefits that might be to your implementation. And so we also look at the error handling, and so sometimes this can be missed, right? And so in areas where you can implement error handling so that you can get notification of errors, and there's different degrees of that implementation. So we show you, here's a configuration-based error handling that you can implement. If you want finer details of the error or better routing of those errors, we can also show you, how to do that. So, we identify some areas where you could get a lot of improvements, and not having to have multiple copies of a project, one for testing, one for production. We can show you that by leveraging the project variables, that you can, keep those projects synchronized across your different environments and make it easier to do local testing of those projects. And so we just, give you a summary of what we found and provide all this information for you, and give you examples, documentation, and talk about how to better improve your projects and where there might be some potential for leveraging other features within the platform that you may not be currently implementing. So that's kind of what the health check looks like. I'll just go back to the slides here. So this is all great, and one way to to get on a path to having access to one of us is to inform your customer success manager that you're interested in a health check, and what kind of timeline and availability you have. And usually we need a week or two once we get access to your org to be able to pull down the projects and also be able to look at the logs within your org. So it'll take us a couple of weeks to pull all that information together, review the projects, and then the CSM will contact you and schedule at your convenience a time when we in about an hour or so, we can run you through these examples and let you ask any questions that you may have, and be able to leverage that time to say, maybe there are some things some low-hanging fruit that I can start on. How do I do that? And put you on a path to be able to improve on the implementation. So some of the learnings that we want to walk you through is just knowing that you have communication that we provide to our customers via the trust jitterbit.com site, where you can be able to get information about system information. You can get information about when new releases are coming out. And so you can go to trust.jitterbit.com to get all of that information, subscribe to that, and be able to get notifications on that. And I'll switch it over to Mayank now, who will talk through some of the other learnings as well.
Thanks, Jaime. So I'm going to go through some of the steps that we take during a health check. A lot of those steps are like a more detailed version, what Jaime already went through in the Word document. But let's dig deeper into a few of those, that how a typical health check looks like. So one of the challenges that we have commonly heard from the customers is once their operation goes down in production, it's down. I mean, the rest of the operations are waiting in the pipeline. So one of the things we check in the health check, if you have a group, agent group in production, which have more than one machine. So what happens is if you have 2 or 3 machines in a group in production and your operation goes down, that gives the ability for the rest of the operations in the pipeline to execute on a secondary machine or a secondary agent, right? A lot of the customers are following these recommendations, but there are some customers who only have one private agent in the production environment. So we're trying to note that and make a recommendation that how can you add a secondary agent in your agent group in production, and what should be the path for it, right? And there are a couple of other things that goes along with it is the upgrades, right? So we recommend to upgrade your agent and be up to date. We're not saying to upgrade it right away, but be within the 6 months timeline, right? Because there are some security patches that will release that goes hand in hand. There's some advanced design principles that we release with the Design in Cloud Studio that you can execute only with an upgraded version of the agent, right? So that's definitely one of the steps that we do. Having more than one agent also allows you to do load balancing, right? You can attain some parallelism for the customers who have more volumes of data to process. And once you grow, if you're new to Jitterbit, you may not see that right away, but once your environment grows, when you have multiple environments and multiple projects running in those environments, having multiple agents allows you to scale as well. So that's definitely one of the steps we see, that having one private agent is not a very good practice. Next slide, please. So this slide also goes hand in hand with the previous slide. And all we are trying to say is the environments needs to be tied to the agent groups, right? So we should be able to, a lot of our customers are following the methodology that they will have dev and QA in one agent group and the prod as a separate agent group. They probably have only one machine for dev and QA and 2 machines for prod, right? So environment needs to be tied to the agent groups. From an upgrade standpoint, a lot of our customers are doing upgrades. If they do have a sandbox environment, they do the upgrades in the sandbox environment first, and then move to dev and QA and prod. This will allow them to test all the code that they have in a specific environment before they can move to a subsequent environment, right? Now, a lot of the customers follow that methodology, but a lot of customers don't. We make sure that when we are doing a health check, we look into those steps, not only from a Jitterbit standpoint, but also from a project lifecycle standpoint, that how many environments do you have? What's your upgrade methodology to make sure you can take full advantage of the upgrades in the agents that are happening. Next slide. Oh, and this is one of the other areas that we dig deeper into. Technically, you can name any operation you want, but when your environment grows and you have multiple environment, there should be a naming convention, right? You should be able to tell just by looking at the environment that what are my endpoints, right? If you have a new business requirement that comes in that tells you, hey, I need to make some mapping changes in all the operations that are communicating to Salesforce or upserting into Salesforce, we don't have to go and open each operation. Just by looking at the operation names, we should be able to tell that, right? So that's definitely a very important step, naming conventions that we check. And we look into that, we see the room for improvements. And if we have to rename some, we give you recommendations how to rename your existing operations and path forward, right? In your future projects, how can you build those operations going forward? Jaime touched upon this in the Word document, the project variables. So some of the customers who have not used the project variables in the project, they're facing challenges during migration, right? If you are not using a project variable, that means you are somewhere hard coding the values of the credentials of your endpoints. That becomes a problem when you migrate, because your credentials in a QA and prod will be different than dev. And when you migrate, you actually have to go into the code and change the code so that your operation should work there, right, seamlessly. So we need to avoid that for sure. And we check that during the health check, whether that step has been followed or not. So what we recommend is you use a project variable to define those credentials. And when you move to a higher environment, you are able to, for the very first time when you migrate, you're able to change the values of those variables. And then going forward, you do not migrate the variables because it's there, right? So you don't have to change them. That way, you do not have to touch your code once you migrate to a higher environment.
Hey, Mayong, before you jump into the next slide, there is a few questions, if you don't mind. I'll just go through a few so then we can address them as we go. There were some questions about opportunities in education arena, which is something we do a lot with education. We have many customers, university colleges. We do a lot around students, donors, and really we can automate a lot of processes around banner or other systems used by the education industry. There was a questions about health check. Is it part of the license? Is there an additional cost? That's something we offer complimentary to your license. We want to make sure then you have what you need to be able to successfully use Jitterbit. So coordinate with your CSM. We'll grant access to one of our architects to your org, identify your project, and go through the health checks. So this is one of the things that you can coordinate with your customer success manager. There was a question where Jaime or Mayank, I'm going to need you to answer. What would be a better practice to run different operations from a script versus operation links to another?
The best practice there is to use a controller script to kick off your operations. So the benefit to that is that you have more control, finer grained control of the orchestration of those operations via a script. So and there's actually a few slides down where we're going to go into some details around that.
Okay, perfect. And then there was another question from one of our other customers. How much having two agents increase the performance? Is it twice faster or else? I'm assuming
so it depends. The question is whether if you add another agent, does it double the capacity? Is that sort of the flavor of the question? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really depends. And so the when you have two agents, they're actually in an active configuration, so they're both receiving jobs to run, and so it really depends on many different variables. It could be the size of each of the messages, the number of fields, the number of transformations. So it depends on a number of variables, and within a health tech, I think we can dive into some of those details. Or if you want to set up a separate session, we can talk through more of those details specific to your use case.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Jaime.
Yeah.
This is something we can do. If we want to dive down into a specific question outside of an health tech, we can always schedule a time with an architect. Mayank, I'm sorry, you were going to add to what Jaime said?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if you have, like Jaime said, it's case by case, right? If you have two independent operations and you have two machines available in the group, one operation can execute on first machine and the second can execute on the second machine. So you have two executions happening simultaneously. So that's where you have more performance, right? But if there is a dependency between the two operations, that the second operation is going to be executed based on the value derived from the first operation, then obviously, even if you have two machines, they're going to be sequential.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, Mayank. And one question that is related to the previous one is there a best practice on limiting the number of projects per private agent group, or would the limitation be the number of simultaneous operation requests?
So there's two things there. There's not a limitation around the number of projects in an agent group. It's more of the number of projects in an environment. And so that environment is associated with an agent group. And so there's not a limit per se on the number of projects within an environment. One thing to keep in mind is that as the number of projects grow within an environment, it does take longer if the agent needed to sync the metadata of those projects to that environment, then it does take a longer period of time. So what we found is that the number of projects is roughly an environment should be between around 75 projects is sort of the sweet spot for the number of projects in an environment. But I think the question, there's a two-part question there, where the second part is the number of operations that run simultaneous, and that is more around the capability, the number of threads that are available within the agent to be able to execute a request. And so, again, and that depends on, how heavy that message flowing through that operation is at any one time, and how much resource that operation is going to consume.
Perfect. So good information here.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's difficult to guide when some answers might be specific, but we want to be here to address those specific questions. So we're here to ensure that if you have a doubt, specifically before you go to production, or as you're starting the design of a new project, then coordinate with your CSM. We'll figure out if it makes sense to set up a session with one of our architects, and then drill down into the specifics of your project. So back to you guys for the remaining of the presentation. I'll jump in if there's other questions.
Okay. So we spoke about the project variables. The next slide was kind of talked about this already when we were talking about the project variables, that please avoid using hard-coded values in the operations of the code. It gives you no flexibility when you migrate to higher operations. You have to come back and test the code again. So please use the variables whenever you see an opportunity. The next slide is to to talk about, one of the questions we are commonly heard that when to use what, right? When to use global variables versus the temp space, and there has been some customers who already went into production without knowing that answer, and now they're coming back and fixing that. So one of the things that we do as a health check is to see which operations are good candidates for global variables as source and target, and which operations are good candidates for temp space. On a high level, the rule of thumb is when you are dealing with a smaller size of data sets, please feel the recommendation is go ahead with the global variables, right? Because it's a memory resident. There's very little I/O involved because you're not writing anything to the disk, and there's a lot of reusability factor associated with that. So go with the global variable if you're using like a real-time transaction, which are smaller in volume because you're executing multiple times in a day, or near real time. You have API calls, which are picking up only few records, right? So anything which is, and there is a number on the slide, 7 kilobyte. We do have customers bigger than 7 kilobyte, but that's our number. If your data sets are smaller and equal to 7 kilobyte, go with the global variable. If you're planning a historical migration, or if you're writing big files or not transactional data, but batch data, then let's not use that. Go with the temp space or even write to a file. So that's what we are trying to explain here. And there's the screenshot that you see tells you the reusability factor. There are 4 different operations, and all 4 are doing different things. You're getting a get, call, then response and request, but all are using the same global variable. So there's a big reusability factor, and you're not writing anything on the disk, so you're saving a lot of IOs. So that's we are trying to say that. Over to you, Jaime.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the other things that we also wanted to cover is when you don't write to the operation log, and so a lot of the information that's flowing through each of your operations it's invaluable to have that information, what is going into an operation and what is coming out of an operation, what request you're making to an endpoint and the response of that endpoint, and being able to log that raw request. And so it's in development mode, is crucial to have that information in order to be able to understand how that endpoint is responding and be able to build schemas around those responses so that you can be able to route based on that information, right? Whether it was successful, not successful, and be able to notify on that information. And so having the capability to write to the operation log as information is flowing through each of the operations does several things. One is that it gives us information to be able to troubleshoot and find out any issues really fast. If you're interacting with support, with Jitter support, right, on trying to, hey, I'm getting an error in this operation, having this information will be able to get you to that resolution a lot faster, just because you have, here's what I submitted and here's what it responded with. And so, being able to compare that against what that endpoint expects will be able to give you a lot of information pretty quick. So there's a bullet there about being able to embrace the pass-through, and that's an option that you have when you're interacting with an endpoint. You can make a request and receive a response and also do a transformation all within the same operation. But what we're saying here is that instead of doing a transformation when you're doing that request, you can select to just have use that activity of pass-through, which means that Jitter is not going to make any changes to that response, and you'll be able to see that raw response, which is very helpful, again, in logging it to the operation log, so that you can see the raw response. And this plays really well with leveraging the same global variable as your source and target. so that you can build on those reusable components for logging and being able to get that type of information. And so, one example that we're seeing here on the screen is on the left is without that logging, and then on the right-hand side with logging, and you can see the highlighted activities here that when we write to that in and out variable, and then we read from that variable and immediately log that variable so that we can see what the request is that we're passing into that operation. And again, once we get a response from it, we again write it to that as an output to that in and out variable and log it again. So that gives us a very detailed information about what's flowing through that operation. And we stress a lot reusability, and these are components that allow us to build on those assets to not have to rebuild this every time that we're doing an operation. We can just drag and drop that into our operations and make our development a lot faster. So one thing that we also wanted to mention is that within a script, when you're running an operation from a script, you have the capability of wrapping that run operation within an if statement so that you can test whether the operation was successful or not. So a lot of times we get questions around error handling, and this is the beginning of that. So when you either kick off an operation or you call a DB execute function to execute, for example, a SQL query on a database endpoint, that you can test and evaluate whether that request for that processing was successful or not. And if not, go ahead and raise an error, getting that detailed error information so that you can act on it. And so, being able to do that is crucial to orchestrating how the flow of your operations.
Thanks, Jaime.
Mike, I'll go ahead and let you take this over.
Yep. Thanks. So we kind of touched upon this earlier about reusability, right? Jaime spoke about it, I spoke about it, and different varietal of use cases, correct? Now let's focus on the script. A lot of the controls, the operations that we build in Jitterbit, a lot of the controls of those operations are in script. A lot of the logic, a lot of the error handling and exception handling are in scripts. But a lot of that logic is supposed to be reused, right? So what we are trying to say here is, if we are able to externalize that logic outside of the operations and reuse that in operations, that's where the real value is. I mean, we don't want to write that logic for every single use case that we're writing, because we'll end up having multiple scripts and operations. You will have a high maintenance cost, high development effort. Even you have challenges while migrating. It's going to be like a proliferation of scripts, correct? So write it once. One of the practices that we do is assign a global variable as an argument and call that global variable in the operation, right? So it's the same logic, but different values for that. So that's definitely one of the steps that we check while doing a health check, that you are not duplicating the effort and writing the scripts over and over again. You're again reusing them with the different values of the global variable. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this one again goes back to the question that someone asked, that when to use how do we control the orchestration of the flows, right? And the next two slides will go a little deeper into that. We'll also talk about when to use the controller script versus the success path, right? So let's talk about the controller script. So like Jaime answered that, it's definitely a good practice practice to control the logical sequence of the script of the operation using a controller, because the controller, which is nothing but a script in Jitterbit, allows you to define the sequence of jobs and flows, allows you to define the dependencies, allows you to tell what to do when there's an error. So going back to our exception handling discussion, right? And again, you don't have to script it over and over again. You build it once and then reuse it with some minor changes in different operations. It also allows you, some of the complex flows requires the developer to debug and insert breakpoints inside the script, right? So it allows you to do and insert breakpoints in the script, and obviously it reduces a lot the development effort and helps the developer to unit test the operation where exactly the problem lies. One of the requirements that we commonly see customers asking is, if there is an operation which is still running, how do we control that the subsequent operation does not run? So sometimes customer would do a lot of development around it to make that happen. One of the steps we do in the health check is to take advantage of that Jitterbit functionality and reduce the development, right, and coding. So one of the ways to do that is to skip execution if the previous operation is already running. That's all we're trying to say on the top of the screen. In the middle of the screen, what we're saying is, one of the alternate ways to define the dependencies in the operation is defining on success path. You know, there has been a good practice in the past where we have the capability to execute the second operation only when the previous operation finishes successfully. It works fine. It works fine as long as you just have to execute the second operation when the first operation finishes successfully. But a lot of times, the second operation, there is a requirement that the second operation should execute based on a value or based on an output of a query, right? So how do we control that? So that's all we're trying to say in the middle of the screen here is, keep those things in mind before choosing which option to go with. Obviously, when you go with the success path, there's a tight coupling. The skip execution you won't have, and then especially the error handling. You know, all those enhanced error logging and exception handling that we spoke about in the previous slide, you will not be able to take that. If you take advantage of that, if you use a controller script, you will be able to embed all those logic together at one place. Slide. And this is definitely one of the key steps we test and look for when we're doing the health check. This is again one of the very common requirements, and that is in a typical ETL scenario, when we're extracting data from, let's say, an endpoint Salesforce and uploading into an endpoint, we would like to tell the Jitterbit operation to execute or to pull only the records that have changed from the last time. So it's more like an incremental, right? A lot of times we have seen customers coding or building operations around it, and it can take away a lot of time. It can add to a lot of development effort. We have a proven way to do that requires only 4 operations to build and a couple of scripts, and that is available, you know, off the shelf. I mean, we can send it to you as a Jitter Pack. And this allows you to pull only the records, incremental records from the endpoint, right? So you're filtering the record on the source. You're not bringing that extra data over to the Jitterbit. And that's always obviously add a lot of value to the performance. Obviously, you don't have to do a full data refresh on the target. It's the the values of the last run and the next run, or when time this operation finishes, is stored in the cache. And like I said, we can send this to you as a Jitterbit. And this is one of the steps, again, we check that how are you handling this scenario in your project? How are you handling the incremental extraction of the source data in your project? Is that following a best practice or not? Over to you, Jaime.
Yeah, I just wanted to add additionally to what you said, Mayank, that it's the cache is one of sometimes it's not so well known, but it has a lot of functionality that's helpful to customers, and so um, you're not able to store a whole lot of data in there, but it's up to 256 characters, so it's for small data sets that you want to cache, and the default is about 30 minutes with a maximum of 30 days. And so there's a lot of benefits to leveraging the cache, and that cache will have a scope of either project-based or environment-based. So just keep that in mind. Philippe, did you want to add something?
Good point.
Yeah,
Good point.
just a couple of questions. So some of the questions, those are great questions. They are a little bit detailed and it's very specific. So we'll do a follow up with, we capture the questions. So we'll follow up with the CSMs to schedule a time with either Jaime or Mayank. A couple of questions that are more generic. The first one I can address, and then Jaime and Mayank, maybe you can address the second one. The first one is, will this deck be available to download? So we'll put that in Success Central. So you'll be able to download the information. I think the video is going to also make it into Success Central, but we'll definitely communicate to let you know where this is going to be posted. There is also a question around what the time frame is for a typical L check. So based on experience of what we have done over the last few years, what expectation should we set here, Jaime, Mayank?
Yeah, it also depends on how many projects that customer has, but we say roughly 1 to 2 weeks. From the time that the customer contacts the CSM. We usually, most of the time, it's within a week, but for some other customers that have large implementations, it would be more up to 2 weeks.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Good.
If a customer has, I was just going to add, Phil, if a customer has multiple projects and all those projects have different patterns, that will add to the time.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. And we'll follow up on the more detailed questions offline.
Yeah, just wanted to wrap up here with a couple more slides around API handling. So for the customers that are using our API module where you're exposing and creating APIs, there are some tips around that in that you can document those APIs. So we have an API developer portal that's part of the API manager where for the APIs that you have built, the tool, the platform will generate that documentation for the developer. So anybody that's developing against that API can go to a central location, get information about those APIs, what the request looks like, what the expected response looks like, any type of security around that API. And so within the API module, the developer portal provides that documentation capability. So also for your APIs, one concern is how to secure that API. And so you have several options around the different security profiles that are available to you to secure those APIs. There's basic authentication, API key, there's OAuth capability, and we support a number of different identity providers, whether that's Google, Salesforce, Okta, or Azure as well. And so you have a lot of options there on securing that API. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you are receiving that information, the API payload or the request that was submitted to that API, that's available in to you to be able to capture in a global variable. And there's an internal Jitterbit variable that you can see there on the screen, Jitterbit API.request.body. And that gives you access to the raw request that was sent to that API and that's certainly something that you want to log and be able to see as that request is flowing through. So another tip is that you want to optimize the operation for quick response, and so APIs are, should be responding in roughly, less than a second or so, and so any APIs that take a really long time to respond are just not going to be conducive to what the expected, what a client would expect, right, for that's consuming that API. So you got to make sure that that API is optimized for a really fast response, and an answer to that might be caching. So that's something to keep in mind. When you want to see the details of an HTTP message in your logs, you need to turn on debug mode. So it allows you about 15 days to have that turned on, and then it goes off. And so, so just keep that in mind, that initially when you want to be able to see those HTTP messages in the log, right? So we talked earlier about the request via the Jitterbit API request.body variable. But if you wanted to see the raw HTTP request, right, all the headers and all of that, you can see that in debug mode when you're in the API manager. So one other thing to remember is that you can manipulate the system variable to also to customize how you respond to an HTTP message. So, and what code you want to send back. So this allows you to create your own custom responses to your APIs. So, for authentication or an invalid request or anything like that, where you wanted to provide custom API response and status code, you have access to be able to set these variables in your via scripting if you wanted to in order to customize the API response. And that's what's the last slide. Philippe, I think if there aren't any other questions from the chat, we're into our Q&A time.
Well, thank you, Mayank and Jaime. That was, I think, very interesting. I think we have addressed most of the questions that were not overly specific. There was one question that came up earlier, which was around what if we overwhelm with the number of changes? How can Jitterbit help, implement some of those changes, so some of those recommended changes? So what will you say?
Yeah, and frankly, that's sometimes as in some organizations have, or some of our clients have inherited, a specific implementation, and they'd like to get to be able to leverage those benefits from the health check. And so, within the health check itself, we provide a lot of examples, a lot of documentation. And so, we can do a follow-up meeting with one of us at the CSA to guide on how to create a sort of a plan for, here are the items that are easier to implement, right? So some of these might be just configuration based and could be easier to be implemented. So a lot of low-hanging fruit. So we could help prioritize those changes and what would be the biggest bang for the buck. And then also, if more help is needed, we can do that through TAM hours, right? So technical account manager, where we give more time. All the way up to a PS engagement as well. So, if there are, if it's just the number of changes are too much, or, the resources aren't there, we can also provide PS to help with those changes.
Yeah, those are all valid points. And we here to help, right? We have this office hours that we do on Wednesday. It's open to all customers. You can join us and come up with a specific question. Sometimes we cover specific topics that might be useful for everybody. We also have those virtual meetings, and we do from time to time. We do, meeting directly with customers when it's very specific, when the question is very specific to their project, or they don't want to share with others because the office hours are open to others. We are working with customers where we implement a portion, or we there to support them while they do the implementation. There is a lot of different ways we can bring the value or help you get to the value. So don't hesitate. Talk with your CSMs. We're here to figure out what works best for you. At the end of the day, we are driven by you getting value out of the solution. So I don't know if there is any other questions, and maybe it's time for Dan to come back on the online, or I don't know if. Let me check. Is there any other questions that anybody wants to post on the questions and answers? Hey, Dan, are you back?
I think I am back. Phil, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Loud
okay,
and clear.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Jaime, Mayank, and Phil, for your architectural and best practices insights on agent groupings, performance tuning, number of projects and operations per environment, message sizes, temp storage and global variables. Great insight and indicative of the type of expertise available to Jitterbit partners and customers. If any of our users and customers care to chat with Jitterbit integration architects, please visit the Success Lounge at any time during our event today. And as Phil said, we are always happy to schedule time with one of our customer success architects if you wish to delve more deeply into these topics or others. And thank you to all of our Jitterbit users, partners, and customers for your attendance and participation in the session. We appreciate your support, your partnership, and your feedback. And as always, we remain committed to your success and to providing you with a stellar customer experience. Now let's wrap up and pick the winner of our Apple AirPods Pro. The winner is Karen Gahn. Karen, congratulations. We'll be reaching out after the event to make arrangements to ship these to you. Now on to our next session in this track, Building Scalable Solutions with Cloud Studio. I will see you over there.